The 360 on Energy and Carbon, hosted by 360 Energy. 360 Energy is a North American leader in energy and carbon reduction. Recently, we have launched the 360 Carbon Excellence Program, designed to make corporate climate change actions more effective and successful. For more information, check the link in our podcast description. Welcome back, Dave and John.
Good to be back.
It's great to be back.
All right. Well, today we're going to be talking about operating renewable energy. This is a bit of a follow-up to our previous episode where we talked about renewable energy basics. Diving right into the episode, where is renewable energy currently being used?
So renewable energy is being used, quite frankly, almost everywhere, but a lot of focus and attention has been used in the grid side where, wind turbines are being put in place, like large infrastructure is being put in place to, one, because of the economies of scale, two, because some of the bureaucracy that's required to actually put generation in place takes a lot of time and effort. So significant amount of renewables has been put on the grid scale. That being said, there are quite a few customers, and it continues to grow, where they're now starting to put renewable generation behind the fence. So whether it's typically solar generation in place, dealing with wind turbines, that can be a little tricky and somewhat problematic to put a wind turbine up by your plant or your location. But certainly, and when we say renewable, it's being used in the manufacturing area where they'll put on their roofs. Certainly commercial, municipal locations are very active in this area, at least in Canada and North America. So it continues to grow and the interest in this. So I think this topic's really timely. John, what can you share from the UK's perspective?
Yeah, I think it is widely used, as you say. Starting at home and domestic level, we had a feed-in tariff arrangement here, which encouraged a lot of people to put solar PV on their roofs. But equally, you can sign up and get grid level renewable energy. So we've got it at that level. And then I think it becomes interesting when you go up to some of the big energy users like data centers. You will see most of the big data center operators now are either saying they are or having 100% renewable electricity to give power the data center. And I think that becomes interesting because they have become targets for, the next big growth area and what's that going to do to climate change. So it's a very interesting response that you say, well, okay, we will switch over to renewables. But you can come across it almost anywhere, ranging from, illuminated signs in the street that are powered by solar power and battery, right the way through to, as we say, something as big and as complex a power user as a data center.
I think it's really interesting you brought, because when I was looking at it is physically how the clients are actually utilizing them on site. But you brought up a very important piece, and that's where customers actually can secure or purchase these renewable power or whatever options are available. It may not be physically on site, but they make arrangements or contractual arrangements to purchase it from someone else. And when I was discussing that, I certainly wasn't indicating that's a very important point that our listeners need to be aware of. It doesn't always have to be on your site. You can arrange contractual situations where you can utilize renewable power, which may not be at your actual site. So good point, John, that you brought up for our listeners.
Yeah, and I think as a point of strength with that is that if you are a really big power user, you haven't got the real estate to actually have renewables on site. The other thing we need to think about as well is that renewables are often being used, shall we say, as a way of showing that you are being sustainable. And I'm maybe wrong on this, but I think recently, it may be Disney in Paris, they covered a car park with solar panels. And the idea is you park underneath the solar panels, protects the cars from the sun, and it goes on there and everyone's going, wow, aren't Disney great at using renewable power? And it's quite interesting that if you were looking domestically in this country, you could look where I am, you could walk down the road and you could see 2 or 3 houses that have got solar panels on them, and you say, aren't they doing good? I'm 100% renewable grid electricity, and you can't tell from my house, so I think I need to put a badge up.
Yes. Yeah, I want to also let our listeners know that, as you indicated, when there was some significant incentives made available, a lot of people would jumped on that.
Yes.
But the people in the last few years that were really all over this were forward thinking, leading edge, or they had significant margin in their business that they could secure this without negatively impacting their business. Now what's happening, and I know we're going to get into this, is it's now being considered by people that may not be early adopters. And they're considering it because it's the new way of doing business for so many reasons that we're going to talk about, but also it's becoming much more cost competitive because the technology has dropped in pricing as well. So there is certainly more interest and will continue to be going forward.
Yeah, I think as well, I think one of the things with any emerging technology, some people don't want to be first adopters. There can be good reasons for that. One, it's much higher risk. Two, it can be that the technology changes significantly. And if you just take a parallel thing, when we were looking for improved efficiency in lighting, people were going over to fluorescent and compact fluorescent lamps, which were not particularly brilliant. But if you'd gone and invested in a whole refurbishment with compact fluorescents, and then a year later LEDs came out, you weren't in a position to take that. So some people delay their investment in technology, perhaps hoping that something better will come along or it will mature. And I think we've talked about this before, but renewable energy, there is still some potential for step improvement in its efficiency. Solar panels they could theoretically be 3 or 4 times more efficient, potentially. I say theoretically, we may not have the technology to do that yet, but, without sort of generating power that's not there.
I'll add to that, John. Like, I know even in the last 7 years, the efficiencies, I think, of those panels were maybe 14%. People are talking about, I don't know if it's there now, but 21 to 25%. That's a huge increase in efficiency.
Something that just struck me, we're talking about the adoption of new technology. Wind power is not new technology, arguably, because you go back in history, we had wind power, and the same with hydro. Various forms of hydro power, which are renewable energy, have been around for a long, long time. So I think the idea that all renewable energy biomass is probably the oldest renewable energy that we've had. And we tend to think of renewable as this new energy. Solar PV, yes, definitely. But some of the others, no, it's not that new.
Agree.
John, you mentioned being 100% renewable. And so now I kind of have a scenario that I want to bring up, and I hope I word this correctly. But let's say there is a business that's grid connected, and they have solar power that can meet their total daily load. However, as we know, when the sun goes down, that solar doesn't work no more, so you need to use your grid power. So let's say the grid power is actually not renewable. Are they able to say that they are 100% renewable energy because they're depending on non-renewable accessibility?
I know where you're going. One of the things we should say is, of course, that if you're trying to be 100% from solar, you've got to have a battery in the solution.
Right.
All right. But if you are using non-renewable grid, then your claim to be 100% renewable, I don't think stands up.
Okay.
I think to claim that you're 100% renewable, you've either got to be off-grid and generating everything yourself renewable, and or a blend of certified, for want of a better word, renewable electricity from the grid. Then you can claim it. Now, if we're going to be really tough on the big data centers that are out there, they do say that they procure or use 100% renewable electricity, but at least once a week they fire up diesel generators, which you need to because you have to have a backup power. But I think most reporters and commentators would not have a go at them for that. And arguably, if they wanted to, they could probably get a biofuel to run those generators, but it's an insignificant percentage. So at that level, the fact that you may be using some electricity that was not zero carbon at some point, you could probably, under materiality, get away with it. If it's your example, though, if you're using a dirty grid, let's call it, we should do air quotes, shouldn't we? Dirty grid. If you're using a dirty grid, you can't claim.
But in the situation, John, you're talking about where, it's claimed to be 100% renewable, that could be a combination of solar and also wind turbine energy that has been purchased, because wind tends to operate heavier in the evening. So it is possible. It's not just when people are buying this renewable energy, it could be a blend of different renewable energy that's being used to actually meet that profile as well.
Okay. So going back to the scenario, I have one more other question. So let's say 75% of it's renewable, 25% of it's from the dirty grid, but they're giving the 25% that they already generate of solar back to the grid. Is there some sort of terminology that instead of 100% renewable, they get to say that they maybe offset it, or I guess it wouldn't be offset, but is there any sort of terminology that they use so far?
You would think of that as an example.
I'm just trying to think of ways organizations use these types of terms. That's all.
Yeah. No, I get what you're saying is that what you're suggesting is that this notional site can produce 100% of its consumption as renewable, but it doesn't use that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think morally you probably could, but I think you'd have to explain it quite well. I do remember somebody I worked with a long time ago who, one of the ways that they had negated their carbon footprint was to say that they had invested in wind turbines that had an equivalent output to the electricity that they used. But they had to make that statement. There wasn't a very quick shorthand for covering.
My sense, John, historically, is it's been done that way. And people don't know enough about the energy system or how people use energy to question that. People like you and I who understand the customer's low profile, and by the way, Lysandra does now, she can now ask those questions, but most clients wouldn't understand how the low profile changes and how that impacts. Coming to your point, Lysandra, I think there'll be more and more emphasis at looking at that needs to be considered going forward. But historically, I don't think the sophistication of people looking and understanding this have actually viewed it in such a manner.
Yeah, what you are touching on, though, which I think we may come back to during the course of this podcast, is there's two ways, there's more than two ways always, but I'm going to think of two ways you could look at if you were sizing renewable energy for on-site renewable energy. One is that you size it for something less than your actual full demand, and you top up the other way. The other way is that you go, we will actually have a bigger on-site generation than we need. But that then gets you into the situation that you have to be able to technically and commercially export your surplus. And what we have found is in some cases people have not been able to do that, and they then end up with a generating plant, for want of a better description, that's oversized. So it's something that needs to be looked at. If only the sun shone 24 hours a day.
Yeah. Thanks for playing along with my curveball scenario. I know we didn't plan for that today, but it came up while you were discussing our first question. So moving on to our next one. Renewable energy has a public view of being expensive. Is this true?
It has a history of being expensive, but there is a way that you could look at it. One of the reasons it's expensive is because fossil fuels have not been charged at the correct price. That's one argument. The other argument is that, and Dave touched on it just a little earlier, the technology was perhaps not at scale, not cost effective, so therefore there were issues there. I think we are now getting to the point in many circumstances where there's at least parity of cost. Although that depends, you still may, if we start getting into the subtleties of the marketplace and what you sign up for, it's going to be complex. But I'm throwing my curveball in now. This is for Dave to pick up on this one. Okay, so we're getting to this sort of parity status, or maybe in some cases where, certainly if we've got to be careful here. If you are generating your own, one advantage you have, you're locking your prices in. But if we look at buying renewable from the grid, now the differential is quite small. But are we going to get a situation as more people drive towards net zero, more people want renewable, and market economics suggests that if there's more demand than supply, prices will go up. So I'll throw that over to Dave to pick that one up and run with.
It's invariably, John, absolutely pricing will go up. But I want to come back to what you said, and I think we've talked about this in our other podcasts. So in Alberta, where a tremendous amount of gas and oil is made available or produced, now some of the renewable contracts in Alberta are actually cheaper, meaning they're selling the power cheaper than some of the gas plants because of the pricing. So certainly currently that's the case, but I would agree, John, as demand goes up, you will see an impact. But I think Stephen Schurg said this, the best way of solving that problem is the higher the pricing goes up, that will solve the problem, because then you'll have more renewable that will come on that will create a greater supply. So I do believe that this will get worked out, and it will, I think it's going to continue to get cheaper as we go forward. Now, one comment I wanted to make, because, being in Ontario, I can say to you, and probably in other jurisdictions, when renewable energy was pretty high, there were certain organizations that kept on blaming renewable energy for the high pricing of our grid. And maybe in a certain degree that was the case, but it's not the case now. And you'll see some people in the industry keep on saying it's so expensive and it's very difficult to operate and to deal with. I just think that's going to change. I think some people are trying to be protective in their own, making sure that their form of generation doesn't get negatively impacted by renewables. But I think renewables are great growth, continued reduction in costs as we go forward.
Yeah, and I just want to come back to the point that if you've bought your own renewables, and if we say something like solar PV, you can expect the solar panels, let's say, to have a 20-year life. Well, arguably, you have now fixed for 20 years what your price on energy is going to be. And that can be quite interesting, because you've got a degree of, in a strange way, you've got a degree of security of supply, because as long as there's sun, or people don't grow trees that take the sun away from you, but putting that sort of thing to one side, you can sort of, you are sort of shielding yourself from the volatility of the market by having your own on-site renewable.
And in fact, there's people in the marketplace that will actually position it that way, that you can lease solar generation and that it's going to be far cheaper to do that over a long term. In fact, I was involved in a nonprofit cooperative, renewable cooperative, and that was the positioning, is that, and in hindsight, I would say that position, knowing and understanding where electrical pricing is in Ontario, it would have been cheaper to do that. So I think if people understand market pricing and market signals, they appreciate how that's going to be impacted, that perhaps this type of renewable contract could be a very positive thing for them to consider, for sure.
Yeah, there is the expression used here, I don't know if you have it, of renting your roof. And yes. The idea is that if you have roof space, somebody will install solar PV on it, and then you can either take the supply from them or even not take the supply from them. They grid feed the supply and pay you something for the pleasure of using your real estate. So There's a whole variety of things there. But I think the other thing we ought to just touch on that has muddied these waters has been government incentives. And there have been, we had here with the feed-in tariff. I mean, what you got at the early stage was well worth it. And in fact, there was a real sweet spot just before they dropped the tariff rate. The price of solar PV had come down, and if you bought and got it then, you had a little money maker. But as government should do, once the incentive has achieved the change that you want, you should remove it. So I think we will see much more transparent sort of market pricing on renewable energy as we go forward.
Agree. So again, depending on the jurisdiction you can be in, there can actually be government disincentive, making it very challenging for people to actually install these in place as well. And that happens in different jurisdictions that you need to be mindful of.
This kind of reminds me of like the cell phones. When cell phones first came out, they were very expensive. Then they got cheap, and now they're getting expensive again.
Yep.
And I think renewable technology will improve and become more efficient, which I think typically leads to equipment getting cheaper to purchase. But then the demand for renewable contracts and the demand for renewables in general will increase in general, resulting in competitive pricing. Is that what I'm understanding?
Yeah, but think about your cell phone, what you can do with your cell phone now, comparison to what you could
True.
do 10 years ago.
That's
Right?
true.
Yeah.
We'll have some fancy featured solar panels and wind turbines.
Yeah, like
Oh,
it's
yeah.
not only electricity, but it could do hot water. There's different things that maybe in the future that could be done.
Next question, and we've touched on this already, but does your utility need to be involved when you're installing and operating renewables?
Why don't you
Okay.
take a stab at it, John, from the UK perspective, and then
Yeah.
I'll give
I
the.
was going to say the big thing there comes down to, do you want to export power? If you want to export power, then you are going to have the involvement of your local utility or distribution company, whichever it is. And you might actually find that Dave was talking disincentives. You might actually find, because, and we've touched on this before about how the grid was designed against big power stations feeding out, and how when we go with distributed energy, it's different. But if you haven't got a, shall we say, a node point on the network that's adjacent to you that can take the power that you want to put into it, you may have to pay to reinforce the grid in order to do that, and that could spoil the I mean, I'm thinking this particularly of a couple of cases I've had where I've been advising clients on wind farms, and they've ended up, I know in one case they had to scale it back so that it would only produce power that they could utilize within their own private network, because the cost of connecting to the grid was prohibitive. So yes, you do need to involve them in those circumstances. I think you've touched on the utility. You probably, depending on your jurisdiction, you're most certainly going to have to get some kind of permit, which is not quite the utility, and it's usually slightly easier for solar PV on your roof. But if you're thinking of putting up a wind turbine, you could face some quite interesting permitting and, shall we say, local objection issues.
Yes. Yeah. So similarity here. I'm just going to add to what John said. Like whether it's a renewable power, cogen, even battery being installed at a location, any possible implication where it has a feedback, negative impact to the grid because of the switching of the equipment on and off, that's a concern, and protection has to be put in place. And if the grids, as John indicated, typically it's not in place because the grid wasn't set up that way, there's a cost implied. You have to study it first, then you have to pay for it. So we've been involved in numerous situations where the customer, it was a great idea conceptually to do it, the economics of doing it, and then all of a sudden you add this incremental cost of study and then adding to enhance the grid to protect it. It became really costly and time consuming. So don't assume this is just, I'm going to just put these solar panels up. There's some thought process, or any generation, you got to be aware of that.
Yeah, I think contacting your utility and figuring out if you're even able to connect to the grid is the first thing you should do before even considering what size of renewables you're purchasing. You might be able to install 1 megawatt and connect to the grid, but let's say your plan initially was 5 megawatts and the grid doesn't have capacity for that. So I think it's really important to keep your utility involved in every step of the way if that's how you want to go about installing your renewables.
And it's sometimes challenging for customers to find out who to speak to at the utility, by the way.
Yeah.
So there's a little bit of work on that one for
That
us.
is a global issue. It's not just, you know.
Yeah, and I'm sure it definitely takes a lot of time and there's a lot of money involved with these applications. So it's unfortunately not as easy as just purchasing it and powering it on. And that's actually brings me right to our next question. If a business wants to install renewables, what are some things they should be mindful of?
Okay, I'll start you off. The first thing you should have done is do all your energy efficiency and all your other work, because you want to get your electrical or heat or whatever demand it is. You want to get it down. Equally, the other thing you want to do is have projections of what it's going to be. And you need to do that sort of analysis. Well, I think then you can start to move forward. But that is the first element of it in planning is working out what it is that you're going to do, and why put in a, let's say, a 1 megawatt renewable plant. Let's not even say what it is, when in fact with doing some energy efficiency you only needed 750 kilowatt. You're going to be spending, and as we will keep on saying, energy efficiency still represents the best investment.
Yeah, and going to what John's saying, you pursue efficiency, but you really need to understand your actual hourly load profile to understand how,
Yes.
if you're adding that 1 megawatt load, whatever that might be, how that will follow or how that can be used based on your load profile, and not only historical, but is what is projected going forward. So don't just look at historical, but based on your operation, what are some of the things that you're expecting? You'll certainly want to ensure, we talked earlier, the regulations that are involved. Can you, can't you, what's involved? I encourage clients to have a number of different parties to quote on it. Don't single source. That's a big mistake. And the other item is make sure you truly understand or get a sense of projected pricing in the marketplace, because that can help you develop a business case. I mean, we talked about it earlier, how it could be beneficial, but I want the listeners to know that sometimes suppliers aren't as well versed about forward market pricing. They'll use historical, or they'll even use numbers that are absolutely wrong, and then you do a business case. So just make sure as a client that you have an understanding of possibly projected future pricing, so you have a sense of the business case behind it.
Yeah, I think a couple of other things to add into that is the difference between if you are the owner of the site or if you're leasing the site. There may be a whole variety of permissions and way leaves, as we would refer them, that for cabling and other things. The classic example that I've come across, I know somebody who works for a local law firm, and they've set up a whole department to deal with the issue. And a classic example of it, multi-story office building. There's a landlord and individual tenants on floors, and one of them decides that they'd like to have solar panels on the roof. And we've had cases where the landlord hasn't been able to bring the cables through the building without the permission of the tenant, and vice versa. So there's all of that kind of mess. And then sticking with the solar panels, and it's an interesting one, and it's a mistake a number of people have made. I made a comment earlier that you can expect your solar panels to last for 20 years. That means the roof that you're going to put them on has got to have a life of at least 20 years in terms of its maintenance. It also needs to be structurally strong enough to take. And these are the kind of things, certainly at the smaller level, and sometimes at the, shall we say, the residential level, that do get overlooked. I mean, you're talking about advances. One of the things that we're seeing now is actually solar roof tiles. So you don't put panels on, you build the roof with effectively tiles that are solar panels. So you're not doubling up and you get everything else there. But I know a number of people have had issues along those lines. The other one I've seen is on a commercial building where the panels were put on the roof, but they hadn't looked carefully enough at the mountings, and they ended up puncturing the waterproof layer of the roof. That becomes expensive then, because then you have to remove the panels to do the correction and put the panels back, and your payback will have gone out the window.
I'd like to add, it's funny how we stir each other here, John. So the other thing is you want to be mindful of what times people are purchasing these. They're doing them for economic, they're doing it to reduce their GHG But if you're leasing or getting incentives, sometimes that negates you from claiming the carbon reduction because whoever owns it, sometimes
Yes.
they own the carbon
Yeah.
reduction or the incentive. If they get an incentive, sometimes the jurisdiction who gives you the incentive, they take the carbon reduction. So these are the little things that need to be really thought of or considered when you're doing this. And it sounds like we're putting all these challenges behind and would stop people, but it shouldn't stop you. I just want you to be mindful of these things that you should be considering when you're doing this.
What we're talking about, the level of complexity and risk, arguably, is not much different to the level of complexity and risk there are with other non-renewable projects.
Agree.
It's just that sometimes, and I'm going to say sometimes, particularly at the residential level, people get carried away and they're, shall we say, sometimes are less scrupulous salespeople. I have heard a story of a contractor who installed solar panels on a north-facing roof.
Oof. I hope that's a joke. Oh, wow. I want to remind our listeners of a point John made for our renewable energy basics episode. John, you said the cleanest kilowatt is the one we don't use. And I think you
Absolutely.
mentioned this again today when you said
Yeah.
make sure you're efficient. And what I want to say is, those efficiencies may cost you a couple $1,000s when you're purchasing from the utility. Your inefficiencies may only be a couple $1,000s. But when you're talking about installing renewable energies, that could actually translate to $100,000 in capital just to meet that load of that
Yes.
inefficiency that you have. So
Yeah.
I think it's really, really important that you're as efficient as possible first before you think of installing any other renewable energy. And even if you decide to continue just using the grid, there's a lot of savings just from improving your business itself.
And improving efficiency doesn't always cost a lot of money. Like sometimes it's just knowledge based. So for our listeners to be aware of as well.
Yeah, that's true. Operational changes. You talk about large amounts of power being used and everything, but if you can change a set point of something by 1 degree, either warmer or cooler, depending whether it's heating or cooling, that can make savings that are really significant for absolutely no capital investment.
Well, to end off this informative episode, what is the biggest takeaway for our listeners?
Well, the takeaway I would say is renewables will continue to increase interests where customers will be more and more inclined to be looking and considering this. So the more knowledge you have, the better served you'll be in choosing the right options that are associated with it. Be mindful that the markets are changing and don't just because you haven't done it before or someone said it was really expensive like 10 years ago, 5 years ago, get up to date because I think it's going to play a bigger role with clients going forward for sure.
Yeah, I would echo that, and I would say renewables are the future. That's the way we've got to go. Increasingly, we've touched on it a couple of times, the war in Ukraine has made us realise how risk we can be with energy supplies. So, the more homegrown energy we've got, it's better from that point of view. It's better from the environment. Don't rush into it. Consider all the options and follow a known pathway to actually implement. And try and get shared experience from people who've already done it. Because very often people that have been either successful or not successful may be keen to share that knowledge with you, and that can be useful.
I think my biggest takeaway would be renewable technology at times can be inflexible, but what is flexible is what you install, how you install it, and how you use it. So explore all your options, try out different scenarios, different combinations of renewables, grid connected, not grid connected. There's a lot of flexibility with how renewables are operated.
Yeah, consider all your options is absolutely right. A bit of time spent scenario playing it costs you some, let's call it management time, but it's well spent.
So, like any other business, the philosophy, if you plan better, it will save you a lot more money and time and challenges going forward.
I think peace of mind is priceless.
Yes,
All right. Well, thank you for another great episode.
it's been a pleasure.
See you next week.
That's all for today's episode of the 360 on Energy and Carbon podcast. Thanks for listening. Make sure to check us out on our website at 360energy.net and follow us on LinkedIn at 360 Energy Inc. Tune in to our podcast on Apple Music, Spotify, Anchor, or other listening platforms by searching the 360 on Energy and Carbon. You can watch the video recording and subscribe on YouTube at 360 Energy Inc. Email us your feedback at podcast@360energy.net or comment on our LinkedIn posts. See you next week.